Angola was a Portuguese colony for like 500 years. 5 centuries. That's a long time to be under someone else's rule. Then, in 1974, there was a revolution in Portugal, and suddenly, they decided to let their colonies go, just like that. For Angola, independence came in November 1975. You'd think this would be a time for massive celebration, right? Freedom at last. But it was complicated. The Portuguese packed up and left pretty quickly. They didn't exactly leave a well-oiled machine behind, more like they just dropped the keys and said, "Good luck, figure it out." This sudden departure created a huge power vacuum. And as we know, nature and politics abhor a vacuum, so who was ready to fill this vacuum? Well, there wasn't just one group, there were 3 main liberation movements. First, you had the MPLA, the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola. These guys were largely Marxist-leaning. Their leader was Agostinho Neto. They had a lot of support in the capital, Luanda, and among educated city folks and some ethnic groups like the Mbundu. They'd been fighting the Portuguese for ages. Their vision was for a socialist Angola, free from Western influence. They pictured a new nation built on principles of equality and state control, ready to chart its own course. Their flag, red and black with a machete and star, became a powerful symbol. Then there was UNITA, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola. Their main man was Jonas Savimbi. Now Savimbi was a very charismatic figure, a powerful speaker, but also incredibly controversial throughout his life. UNITA drew most of its support from the Ovimbundu people, who are the largest ethnic group in Angola, mainly in the Central Highlands. They presented themselves as the true African nationalists, fighting against what they saw as MPLA's communism. Savimbi promised a different kind of Angola, one that wasn't aligned with Moscow. He too had a history of guerrilla warfare and was not about to let the MPLA just take over without a fight. And the third group in this complicated mix was the FNLA, the National Liberation Front of Angola. Holden Roberto was their leader. The FNLA had strong support from the Bakongo people in northern Angola, and they had close ties with Mobutu Sese Seko, the dictator of neighboring Zaire, which is now the DRC. Like the others, they had also fought against Portuguese colonial rule, but they were generally seen as more pro-Western. Their power base was geographically distinct. So, you had these 3 groups, each with its own leaders, its own ethnic support base, its own ideology, and its own army. It was like a 3-way tug-of-war waiting to happen. And Angola was the rope. So, independence arrives in November 1975, but instead of champagne and parades for everyone, it's more like the starting gun for a massive, tragic fight. The Portuguese basically just walked away. Imagine throwing a massive party, and then the hosts just vanish, leaving 3 extremely ambitious and armed guests to decide who gets the biggest slice of cake. That was Angola. The capital, Luanda, immediately became contested ground. Each of these 3 movements, MPLA, UNITA, and FNLA, believed they were the rightful leaders of the new Angola. There wasn't much appetite for power sharing or coalition governments. It was pretty much winner takes all from day one. The dream of a peaceful, united, independent Angola started to unravel very, very quickly. The MPLA controlling Luanda quickly got some very powerful international friends. The Soviet Union, deep in the Cold War with the USA, saw an opportunity. They started sending weapons, advisors, and a whole lot of material support. And then Cuba, under Fidel Castro, did something pretty extraordinary. They sent thousands of combat troops to Angola, tens of thousands eventually. Castro framed it as an act of international solidarity, helping a fellow revolutionary movement against imperialism. These Cuban soldiers were crucial in helping the MPLA secure the capital and the all-important coastal oil fields. For the Soviet bloc, Angola was a key strategic piece on the African chessboard, another red flag on the map. Naturally, the other side of the Cold War wasn't just going to sit back and watch. UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi, also found its own set of powerful backers. The United States, under various administrations, was very wary of a Soviet-backed Marxist government in southern Africa. So, they started supporting UNITA, often covertly at first through the CIA, sending weapons and funds. And then there was apartheid South Africa. They were terrified of having a communist-led, black-ruled nation on their border, especially one that might support Nelson Mandela's ANC. So, South African military forces directly intervened in Angola, fighting alongside UNITA troops against the MPLA and the Cubans. It made for some strange bedfellows. America, champion of democracy, allied with a racist apartheid state. Politics, hey? The FNLA, Holden Roberto's group, also had its international supporters initially. They received backing from the United States for a time, and significantly from Zaire, due to Roberto's connections with Mobutu. Even China briefly supported them, seeing it as a way to counter Soviet influence. The FNLA, with Zairean troops, tried to march on Luanda from the north around the time of independence. However, they were decisively defeated by the MPLA, who were heavily bolstered by the newly arrived Cuban forces and Soviet weaponry. After this major setback, the FNLA's military strength and political influence declined sharply. They became a much smaller factor in the ensuing conflict, leaving the MPLA and UNITA as the two main contenders in this devastating, foreign-fueled civil war. The war wasn't a quick affair. It dragged on for an agonizing 27 years. Think about that, more than a quarter of a century. A whole generation of Angolans grew up knowing nothing but conflict. It was incredibly brutal. The MPLA government, propped up by Cuban troops and Soviet aid, controlled the cities and the oil wealth. UNITA, backed by the US and South Africa, controlled large swaths of the countryside, particularly in the south and east. South African forces repeatedly invaded Angola, not just to support UNITA, but also to attack bases of SWAPO, the Namibian independence movement that Angola supported. Ordinary Angolan people were the ones who suffered most, caught between these warring factions and their powerful international sponsors. Villages were razed, families displaced, and futures destroyed. There were many battles, but one of the most significant was the Battle of Quito Cuanavale in 1987 to 1988. This was a massive confrontation. The MPLA's army, FAPLA, with strong Cuban and Soviet support, launched a major offensive to try and crush UNITA. UNITA, backed by the South African Defense Force, resisted fiercely. The battle was long and bloody with heavy casualties on all sides. While there was no clear outright military victor, the South African Defense Force took significant losses and was halted. Many historians argue that Quito Cuanavale was a turning point. It demonstrated that the apartheid military was not invincible. Some even say it contributed to the pressures that eventually led to Namibia's independence and the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa. It was a truly pivotal moment in Southern African history, fought on Angolan soil. Then, as the Cold War itself began to thaw in the late 1980s, the superpowers started to lose interest in funding their respective proxies. The pressure for peace mounted. In 1991, a breakthrough. The MPLA government and UNITA signed the Bicesse Accords. This agreement paved the way for a ceasefire and multi-party elections, scheduled for 1992. There was so much hope. Angolans went to the polls in huge numbers. It felt like a new dawn. The MPLA won the election, according to international observers. But Jonas Savimbi and UNITA refused to accept the results. They claimed fraud. And just like that, the hope was shattered. UNITA went back to war, and the fighting resumed with even greater intensity in many areas. It was a devastating blow. The 1990s saw some of the worst fighting of the entire war. UNITA, controlling diamond-rich areas, funded its war machine through the sale of these blood diamonds. The MPLA government, in turn, used its oil revenues to buy weapons and maintain its army. The country was effectively partitioned. Civilians continued to bear the brunt of the violence with widespread atrocities and a humanitarian crisis that shocked the world. The United Nations tried to intervene with peacekeeping missions, but peace remained elusive. The conflict seemed intractable. Then, on February 22, 2002, came the news that changed everything. Jonas Savimbi had been killed in combat by Angolan government troops. His death proved to be the decisive turning point. With Jonas Savimbi, the charismatic and unyielding leader of UNITA, gone, the will to fight within the rebel movement quickly dissipated. His personal leadership had been so central to UNITA's decades-long insurgency. Just 6 weeks after his death, in April 2002, a ceasefire agreement was signed between UNITA and the MPLA government. This time, it held. After 27 devastating years, the Angolan Civil War was officially over. Imagine the relief, but also the exhaustion. For millions of Angolans, an entire lifetime had been spent under the shadow of war. The silence of the guns was a profound change, but it also laid bare the monumental task of healing and rebuilding a shattered nation. The human cost of this protracted conflict was almost unimaginable. Estimates suggest that as many as 1.5 million people lost their lives. Think about that number. And these weren't just soldiers. Countless civilians, men, women, and children perished. Beyond the deaths, over 4 million Angolans were internally displaced, forced to flee their homes and villages, becoming refugees in their own country. And then, there were the landmines. Millions of them, scattered across the countryside, making Angola one of the most heavily mined nations on Earth. These hidden killers continue to claim victims today, long after the fighting stopped, maiming and killing innocent people and preventing farmers from returning to their land. The psychological scars on the survivors, especially children who witnessed horrific violence or were forced to become soldiers, run incredibly deep. Economically, the war was a catastrophe for a country that should have been prosperous. Angola is blessed with abundant natural resources, particularly oil and diamonds. This wealth could have transformed the nation, funding development, education, and healthcare for all its citizens. Instead, for decades, these resources were largely diverted to fuel the war. Billions of dollars went into buying weapons, tanks, and ammunition. Infrastructure like roads, bridges, schools, and hospitals was destroyed or fell into disrepair. Agricultural production collapsed as people fled the land. The economic potential of Angola was tragically squandered, leaving a legacy of widespread poverty despite the nation's underlying riches. In the aftermath, the MPLA, led by President José Eduardo dos Santos for many years after Nito, and then by João Lourenço, has remained in power. UNITA transformed into the main opposition political party, participating in elections. This is, of course, a massive step forward from armed conflict. Angola has seen significant reconstruction efforts, especially in infrastructure, largely funded by oil revenue. However, the challenges remain enormous. Poverty is still rampant. Corruption has been a persistent problem, siphoning off wealth that could benefit the population. True national reconciliation after such a bitter and divisive war is a slow and ongoing process. Angolan people, with their incredible resilience, are striving to build a peaceful and more prosperous future. But the shadows of those 27 years of conflict are long and still touch many aspects of life today.